Welcome to the Repro 360 webinar that we're running this evening. Thank you to all of those that have logged in. So this evening we're doing a webinar which Shane Thomson from Holbrook Vet Centre has been kind enough to present, managing the high fertility beef herd. Just before we start, I'd just like to do a bit of housekeeping. I trust all attendees have a little pane on their right-hand side. You'll notice there's two little options there. There's a section where you can put questions in. So we really encourage questions throughout the entire webinar. So if you type them in at the end, we'll have a question time where I'll come back online and I'll then ask Shane and he can respond. And if there's any issues or you just want to communicate throughout the webinar, you'll see also a little chat pane that you can go onto and type any messages that you'd like to send through at that point in time. So welcome Shane to our webinar. Just to give you a bit of background on Shane, he's a veterinarian and partner at Holbrook Vet Centre with a strong focus on production and breeding services in the beef industry. They service artificial breeding for both seed stock and commercial producers Australia-wide, and this includes artificial insemination, embryo transfer, bull fertility exams, ultrasound pregnancy diagnosis. And in addition to Holbrook Vet Centres on-farm reproductive services, they also run a specialised artificial breeding centres managing donors for embryo production with a large-scale recipient herd. Shane recently has completed, his veterinary training at Charles Sturt University and Wagga, and is currently undertaking a Masters in Whole Farm Veterinary Consultancy through the Fred Morley Centre at CSU. And this degree focuses on the analysis of farm systems as a whole and the provision of sustainable and economically viable production advice. So in addition to Shane's role at Holbrook Vet Centre, he also maintains a strong connection with the realities of beef cattle production through his commercial cattle enterprises that he manages with his wife Katie and his two sons. So thank you, Shane. I will now hand it over to you and we look forward to it and we'll talk at the end.
Thanks very much, Sophia. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start just by thanking Vet Aquadol and their Repro 360 initiative. I think there's a lot of valuable information that they are putting together for everybody's resource. So a big thank you to them, and I'm very excited to be involved tonight presenting this information. Before I get into it, I just wanted to have a little bit of a introduction on who we are. Sophia's given us a really good rundown of our business, but we are a large and professional collaborative team, and we focus on breeding solutions for both seed stock and commercial producers across Australia. We're very driven in assisting beef producers to make better and more profitable decisions, and as Sophia outlined, there's a suite of services there that we provide these producers, but we also have the donor centre and contract recipient herd, so that makes a big part of our business, and that's a little bit about us. So today, I'll just see if we can click on the next slide. So today we're going to have a little bit of a talk about what a high fertility herd is, and I think there's been plenty of presentations and plenty of information out there describing what fertility is and why fertility is a benefit, but we can't sort of gloss over that too much because it's really important. So we'll talk about that. I'll give you a couple of tips and tools as to how to maximise performance of your breeding program. But what I really want to focus on tonight is looking at some of the risks versus rewards of a high fertility breeding herd, and most importantly, how we mitigate those risks to ensure long-term profitability. So there are some risks associated with high performance and high fertility, and we'll have a look into how we make sure they don't get in the road of long-term profitability. So if we start with fertility, what is it? I think that we'd all agree that the ability for a cow to become pregnant is probably number one. Calving unassisted, that would certainly be nice, and raise a calf to weaning, I think that would be handy as well. But the reality is, it's the ability of a female to do all of the above on an annual basis, starting as a 2-year-old heifer. And when we have a look at the records on how many females are capable of doing this, it's far less than we think. Now, sorry, I should just interject. Sophia did mention that we'll have some questions at the end. But as we're going, if anything sort of flashes up that's really important, make sure you jot it in that question pane, because we'll be able to link up with it at the end. So how does fertility actually affect profitability? I would challenge everybody that high fertility is not high pregnancy rates, that it's in fact the conception pattern. It's all about the number of calves being born unassisted in the first cycle, and this is why fertility is influencing profitability. And there's a couple of major ways. First is by increasing the average age and therefore weight of the calf. So obviously the older a calf is, the more opportunity it has to gain weight. But it goes a little bit further than this. When we set up a breeding enterprise, there's a couple of decisions we've got to make. And first is obviously what sort of enterprise we're going to run. The second is what sort of stocking rate we're going to run. But then we've got to decide when it is that we're going to calve down these animals. And the objective here is to decide, what does our pasture growth curve look like? What are our animal requirements? And how do we best match these two things together such that we can ultimately rely on being a extensive grazing system and rely on pasture being our source of energy. So we want to have as many calves born as possible within this ideal calving window, because that's when we're going to be able to grow beef at the lowest cost. The other major driver of profit from fertility is its ability to increase the ongoing performance of females within the herd and reduce dystocia. So we know that females that calve as early calving females in the herd will be able to retain that status and repeatedly produce an early calf every year. Similarly, there's a bit of a vicious cycle with the ones that are late calvers. We know that if they calve late in the calving period, they're going to be a later calving animal year after year. And if anybody's tried to move their calving period forward, they will remember that it's very difficult to actually bring a calving date forward. Dystocia, why does high fertility reduce dystocia? We'll talk about this a little bit later on, but the link there is ultimately that as animals calve down early calves, those calves have got a longer period of time with which to grow, and therefore a heavier heifer's at joining. So the heavier a heifer is at joining, the easier it is to manage a pregnancy to ensure that we control a number of those factors that lead to dystocia. But growth of the heifer at breeding and control of her nutrition late in pregnancy is two of the major links. The final thing I'll add here is that fertility has low heritability, so it is certainly about making the correct management decisions and placing selection pressure on the reproductive performance of individuals within the herd. And we'll have a little bit of a look into that as well. So I've just got an example here, and normally I get people to show a bit of a raise of hands, but that's obviously a little bit tricky through a webinar. So I'll just run through it as a bit of an example. We've got two herds here, herd A and herd B. We need to assume that the genetics in both of these herds is exactly the same, and that in effect that they're on the same farm, but they're just managed differently as far as their joining and their fertility. So we need to decide which one of these two herds of animals, same number, let's say for instance there's 100 cows in each herd, which herd are we going to buy? So the first thing we want to know is, what is the pregnancy rate in that group? So herd A's got 98% pregnant, herd B 90% pregnant. Which herd would we like to buy? Now obviously if pregnancy rate was our only indicator of fertility, we would be looking at the 98% result and saying, well, they're a higher pregnancy rate, therefore they're more fertile. But I would challenge you to suggest that doesn't tell the whole story. So there's some more information we'd like to know. What is that information? Normally people are pretty forthcoming in suggesting that we want to know how long they're joined for. So if I suggested that herd A was joined for 10 weeks, but herd B was joined for 6 weeks, we can start to appreciate that potentially, although this herd A group has a higher number of pregnancies, they could be spread out over a longer joining period and therefore a longer calving period. And we can appreciate that the herd that's only got 90% only got it in 6 weeks. So they potentially have a higher concentration of calving, but there's still more information we want. And that information is what's happening in the first cycle. So in the first 3 weeks of a calving period, that's the critical time for influence on overall fertility. And if we look at herd A, they've got 40% calving in the first 3 weeks, as opposed to herd B, which has 70% calving in the first 3 weeks. So we can start to appreciate that there's a huge or a much more significant number of calves being born early in the calving in herd B than there is in herd A, and that pregnancy rate isn't really telling us the whole story. So I would describe herd A as low fertility and herd B as high fertility, despite being obviously difference in pregnancy rate. But I've got a bit of a picture to take this further. So if we have a look here, we've got our red herd, which is the low fertility herd. And we can see that they've got a 10-week calving. On the graph here, we've got on the y-axis, we've got the conception rate, and across the bottom, we've got the cycle. So we can see in that first cycle of 3 weeks, we've got 40%. I'll just get a bit of a pointer here to make it more obvious. So we can see here we've got 40% in this first cycle, 30% in the second, 22 or 3% in the third, and then 5% in the fourth cycle. Let's go to the next slide here. So if we put up our blue herd, which is herd B, with a 90% preg rate over 6 weeks, we can see that there's 70% in that first cycle and then 20% the second cycle. So we can visually start to appreciate there's a lot more pregnancies early in the calving in this group here than there is here, where they're a lot more spread out. But if I put this a slightly different way again, so I've graphed these two herds the same. So we've still got our red herd, which is our 10-week or 70-day calving. We've got our blue herd, which is the 6-week or 42-day calving. On this axis here, on the y-axis, we've got the percentage of empty cows. So obviously, 100% of the cows are open and empty on the day we put the bulls in, and that number decreases as time elapses. So what we can see is that the number of empty cows is far more rapid in reduction in the high fertility herd, and in effect, what we're describing is that this area here between the two lines is lost potential. So this is the difference in age between calves of the low fertility red line and the high fertility blue line, and that area there is potential that those animals will have to gain weight. So we can appreciate that conception pattern or the spread of calves across the calving has a big influence on their average age. We'll have a look into why that's got a financial influence, but it's a difficult number. Whenever we benchmark or compare, we like to have simple numbers that we can use. So pregnancy rate is typically a very handy number, and we can compare using it, but it doesn't tell the whole story. What we're suggesting is the use of an index called average calving dates, or ACD. So what the average calving date does is it takes into account the spread of the whole calving and provides us with ultimately another single number that we can use to benchmark between farms and between years. The way that it's calculated, it's influenced by two main factors. One is the length of the overall calving, and two is the number of calves born in the first cycle. So if I've calculated it for the herds here, we can see that the average calving date of our 6-week calving is about day 16, and the average calving date of the 10-week low fertility calving is day 30. So there's a 14-day difference. What that means is that every calf in the herd, every calf in this herd B is 14 days younger than the calves in the high fertility herd. So those 14 days is opportunity for the calves to grow. If we put a dollar figure on that, that's equivalent to $70 per calf for every calf in the herd. So that's quite significant. How do we come up with those figures? So we've talked a little bit about the benefit of fertility, but certainly first and foremost is the increase in average age and weight of the calves. We've got the improved rebreeding of the cow and her subsequent calves. So we know that if we carve her down as an early calver, we manage her appropriately, she can give us, again, earlier and heavier calves in subsequent years. We've then got improved management efficiency. So things such as monitoring calving. The shorter we can have a calving period, the less labour inputs we need to have into monitoring and managing that process. Similarly, we've got calf marking, weaning, and marketing of the cattle. So the tighter they are in age, the more finite we can be in our selection of time to do some of these management procedures. And when it comes to marketing, they're a tighter group that can be marketed at a more similar time. So there's a mild benefit in reduced costs there. I think it's important to note there's certainly reduced dystocia and calf deaths. So for something, I've used here the example of calf scours or calf diarrhea. We know that in a lot of enterprises, there's particular areas that are suitable for calving animals, especially heifers. And the longer that a calving period will go on, the more environmental contamination we'll get of those particular paddocks. So one of the advantages of short calvings, or if you will, batch calvings, is that we can get these animals in, calved and moved out, and we don't have this sort of ongoing lingering effect where contamination will build up in the environment. And so obviously there's a reduction in cost associated with those losses, but also intervention and treatment fees. There's lower cost weaning, and I think this is a big one. It's hard to quantify, but we know that the tighter these animals are in age, the less of a tail there is to the calves, and that's got a bit of a double effect. One is that obviously we can sell those calves as a group earlier, but similarly, I would argue that one of the big reasons that we want to match our animal requirement with our pasture growth curve is that as these calves grow, they increase in weight, and the percentage of their intake on a daily basis that they need for maintenance reduces as they get heavier. So a young calf needs a large percentage of its intake just to maintain its weight. And so what I'm suggesting here is that once we wean these calves, if there's an 80 kilo range between the heaviest and the lightest calves in the mob, that's not going to stay the same post weaning. That gap is going to become bigger because the heavier calves are going to be capable of gaining weight quicker than the lighter calves. So by having them closer in weight, we can manage them better. We've talked about the even sale groups, better heifer breeding. This is coming from better enrolment and subsequent breeding. So what we know is that the older they are, the heavier they're going to be at breeding. The earlier they're going to have reached puberty, and the easier they are to breed. So if we put a dollar value on this, we come up with $5. We come up with $4 to $7, but working on $5, this is equivalent to about $100 a cycle. So each day of calf age is equivalent to $5, which is quite significant. Some of the other benefits, we've talked about the benefits being long-term and perpetuating. We know that early calves are resulting in earlier pregnancies as maiden heifers, which sets them up to remain an early calver throughout their life. Anecdotally, one of the benefits that's often spoke about is that there's no difference between calves from heifers or cows, and I think there's some reality to that. Calving heifers prior to cows is often a tool that's used, but by using a short calving period, a lot of these benefits can be achieved, which I'll run you through. Joining 90% of your heifers, this would be one of our key recommendations. So if people took nothing away from this talk other than retaining and joining as many of your heifers as possible, then that would be a good outcome. But one of the kickbacks for retaining a large percentage of heifers is that you're keeping them at a time when over spring, generally in a spring calving herd, we've got a lot of pasture that's unlikely to be utilised, and by putting more weight on these heifers, we enhance the fertility potential of the herd, but we also have heavier sale options for heifers. So I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that we need to use all these tools to make sure that we start females as early calvers, and this is the biggest step to managing an early calving herd. This is just another graph to describe the difference in fertility. So what I've done here, and we'll just go over it briefly, we've got a 6-week calving here, we've got an 8-week calving, 9-week calving, and a 12-week calving. On this axis here, we've got the conception rate cycle by cycle. So each column represents each cycle of that calving period. Down the bottom, you've got your pregnancy rate, and then I've calculated the average calving date of those joinings. And if we compare to that 12-week calving here with an average calving date of day 33, I've just done a dollar comparison using it as a reference. So if we had a 12-week calving and we took it back to a 9-week calving, that would give us a $40 benefit per calf. If we went to an 8-week calving, that'd be a $65 benefit per calf. And if we went all the way to a 6-week joining, there'd be an $85 advantage. So there certainly is a lot of economic advantage to high fertility. So how to improve fertility is probably the more important component. I think firstly, the most important thing is to understand and work towards breeding targets. So unless producers are happy to identify targets and work towards achieving them, then improving fertility can be really difficult. understanding and managing the conception pattern. I think that ties into the point above, and I've got a bit of an image to show that, but understanding that those early calves are more valuable, understanding that we've got tools to identify them, and having the diligence to use that information and select for them is the biggest tool in improving fertility. And more important than anything else is understanding that we've got to put our hand up and as managers, manage our herd's fertility. So it's extremely lowly heritable. For instance, days to calving, which is our best EBV for fertility, has a 7% heritability versus something like intramuscular fat or marbling, which has a heritability of 32%. So what we're suggesting here is that 7% is related to genetics, which means more than 90% of the outcome in fertility is a result of environment, and environment is ultimately the situation we create through our management. So it really is in our control. What are the things we can control? We've obviously got management of the female, management of the bull, prevention of disease, and then pregnancy management. And you might ask, what do I mean by pregnancy management? But we'll cover off these 4 things now. So what sorts of things can we manage when it comes to the female? We've got heifer retention, development, and dystachia management, and I do tie these things in together. So retaining enough heifers, ensuring they're well enough grown, and ensuring that we have them grown well by the time of breeding, but also have them at a weight where they become easy to restrict them in that last trimester of pregnancy, can help us prevent dystachia. We've got selection of the time and length of the calving period, and this is really important because it's the thing that we can control to make sure that we are actually calving at a time when we've got our peak in pasture growth. We've got body condition at calving. We can control that of the female by either feeding them pre-calving or ensuring that we wean them at appropriate body condition. We've got the feed available post-calving, and then we've got days post-calving. And days post-calving is ultimately a product of the 2 above. So the body condition of the cow at calving, in conjunction with the feed available post-calving, will determine how many days it takes that cow to resume cycling. The final thing we can manage is time of weaning, and I would suggest that it is one of the most important because it's what's setting us up, especially when it comes to body condition. The objective is to wean a cow in the body condition score we would like to be calving that cow, and as a dry animal, she has quite a low maintenance requirement over ultimately the autumn-winter period in a spring calving herd, and that's a time when we need to be allocating our feed resources to the young stock. So having her at an easy maintenance level is important. Bull management, I break these down into 2 key components. We've got the management of pre-existing bull fertility problems, and then we've got bull failures that occurred during the joining period, and I'll elaborate on those 2 in a second. Disease prevention, it depends a little bit on the region. In southern Australia, southeast Australia, where we're operating, the most important diseases will be vibriosis and pestivirus, and then potentially lepto, but we'll have a little bit of chat about those couple. To put it into perspective, I just wanted to show this pie chart here ultimately that represents the annual reproduction cycle of the cow. So if we have a cow conceive here, we know that we've got a 280-day fixed period of pregnancy. She's going to be pregnant for that amount of time. So that means she's calving here. For that, we then have what we call a postpartum interval. And this is the period, a lot of different names, post-calving interval, postpartum interval, but this is the period where after calving, a cow needs to ultimately clean out her uterus, resume some ovarian activity, and ultimately resume cycling. So I've put 50 days in here, but understanding that 50 days could be anywhere from as low as 35, 40 days right up to 100 days. And there's a really nifty table in a slide or 2 that shows a few differences there. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that 50 days is a bit of a best case scenario. And if we use that number, we've then got 35 days with which that cow can rebreed to be calving on the same date the following year. So that's only 2 estrus opportunities with the bull. Now, it doesn't take much for one of those opportunities to be missed, whether that be timing, whether that be issues. and that calving date can slip back. And what's more, if we have first calvers that happen to be calving in a light body condition, this 50-day postpartum interval can blow out to 80 or 90 days. And so it's hard enough to get first calvers to rejoin for the same calving date, let alone advance them forward. The fourth component was managing pregnancies. Now, what does this mean? What I want people to take away from this is that joining periods don't have to equal calving periods. So if you want to have a short calving period, and there's a heap of reasons to have it, there's two ways to do it. One is to have a short joining period, and I'm going to point out to you why I think that's high risk. The other is to have a joining period and use a couple of tools to select from that joining period a short calving. The tools that I'm talking about are ultimately early age pregnancy diagnosis. So with the tool of ultrasound or manual pregnancy diagnosis, but using ultrasound is more accurate, we're able to age the fetuses, record the data, and potentially select out whatever length calving period we want. Now, you might say that that's not necessary if we're prepared to join for a short period. So we might have a 3 or 6 week joining period, but if something goes wrong, whether it be with disease or preparation of the females or injury to the bulls, that short joining leaves us open to a very poor pregnancy result. As if we're prepared to have a longer joining and use these tools to select out a shorter period, then we're ultimately more robust to some of those issues. In order to get comfortable with what your herd's fertility is, and if you've missed the opportunity to complete early age pregnancy diagnosis, then recording the number of females calved after each cycle of calving is a good way to get a bit of a feel for how they're performing. So you just take a tally. Now, whether that's weekly or daily or fortnightly, but taking a tally of animals as they calve and mapping that out to understand roughly where are my calves within the joining period can give us the confidence to shorten it in future years. But I think what's really important, and the take-home point, is that profitability is driven by when the cows are pregnant, not if they are. So it's important that we understand we do have the ability to identify and retain the high-value early pregnancies. And that's not saying that this is the only selection criteria. So there might be a cull for age group, or there might be selection on foot and leg structure or udder structure. And certainly they're important selection criteria, but this is also another criteria we can use. Just a bit of an example. So what actually are the breeding targets? And if a herd is aiming to keep retain 60% of their heifers, they'll be looking to turn over about 25% of their cow herd annually. So if they're doing that, the average herd would only need somewhere between 70 and 80% pregnant overall to have enough replacement numbers. So it continually baffles me why we're often talking 95 or 98, or we've got producers getting disappointed with their pregnancy results unless they're in the high 90s. And as a vet that provides a lot of these services, I really enjoy when I go on farm and a producer says, oh, we only need to get 75% today, or we only need 80% out of this mob. And it tells me a couple of things, but the most important is that they've got a full grasp on ultimately what stocking rate they want to run, and therefore how many calving females they need. But they've got an understanding that they want to target the high fertility females and that they're not being distracted by pregnancy rate, which is, as we've identified, a poor indicator. So if we have a look at these two herds here, they're actually the same fertility herds. They're both high fertility groups. We've got 70% in the first cycle and 70% in the first cycle over here. But this herd is an 8-week calving with a 95% preg rate, and this herd is a 6-week calving with a 90% preg rate. All that's happened is that this manager has left the bulls in for 8 weeks, as where this manager took the bulls out at 6 weeks. Now, that's good, and they've enhanced the fertility, and we know that this will have about a 16-day average calving date, whereas this will have a 20-day average calving date. But what I'm arguing is that with the use of pregnancy diagnosis, we're able to identify and remove these animals without the need to have that shorter joining. Not that the difference between 6 and 8 weeks is significant from a joining point of view, but it is worth about $900 per 100 calves, just simply cutting that third cycle off. So there's some options we've got. What are some of the risks? So when I talk about risks, people often sort of twist their face up and look at me. What I'm suggesting here is that short joining periods put increased pressure on the breeding program, and this is coming from things such as bull injuries, virgin bulls that are inexperienced, female postpartum intervals and nutrition. So if we're in a tough year and cattle are calving a little bit lighter than we would like them to, or we can't provide them the nutrition we would ideally be providing them, then this is going to blow out that postpartum interval, and we're going to struggle to get them to be rejoining at the same time they did last year. We've got reproductive diseases that can come in, and certainly we've got preparation of the heifers. So what we used to see is that longer joining periods would allow this disease or these issues to come and go within the joining. So we would often see that the pregnancy rate would recover. However, the conception pattern and average calving date would suffer significantly. So you would have a lot of pregnancies clustered towards the end of the joining period where things were recovering. However, that had a big influence. Knowing that every day is worth $5 in calf value, that would have a big influence on the profitability of the calf drop. All this means is that we need to understand that there is some risk and manage these issues to prevent lost income through any failure or breeding program failures. And I think that it's important to note that the vast majority of sub-fertility problems that we investigate as vets involve new bulls or bulls in a single side joining situation. So trying to manage those couple of scenarios would certainly leave us in good stead with most of the issues we see. So why do joinings fail? Certainly with females, the top things we see would be body condition at calving being inadequate, so too light, days post-calving, feed post-calving, and we've talked about how they're very much linked. The days post-calving is a product of their body condition plus the feed that we provide them. We've got issues with bulls, so existing issues with older bulls at joining, and then issues that develop during the joining period. So this relates to all bulls, but certainly the existing issues are either the old bulls that we've got in the herd or young bulls that are coming in that are potentially not tested. So the assumption is most young bulls that come from reputable places that have been tested should be sound at the start of joining, and it's about monitoring for issues that develop. The third thing I think is important is having an inadequate joining ratio following artificial breeding programs. So a lot of producers think that artificial breeding is a way to run less bulls, but we need to understand that although a percentage of those animals are pregnant by the time the bull goes in, the ones that are not pregnant will come in over a much shorter period of time. And in fact, we would recommend 1 per 30 following an artificial breeding program, and the work rate on the bulls in that scenario is more than if you put a bull per 60 in a normal natural mating. Then we've got disease. So again, Vibrio, Pesty and Lepto are the major players there. Now, there is no irony whatsoever that these factors that cause joinings to fail are the exact same list as the things we can manage. And I think that's a really important point to make, in that we are in control of all the common things that do cause reproductive failure. So we'll have a bit of a run through now in what we suggest we do to prevent them. So whenever I am asked to set up a prevention program, I think it's important to start with identifying the sources of risk and then coming up with a strategy to prevent them. Too often do we have preventative programs that are just sort of rolled out and aren't based on evidence. So it's important that we identify what are we having issues with and how do we prevent that. As far as the females, obviously we've got to target a specific calving time and length of joining for the environment, and that's going to vary across environments. So if people happen to move the location of their operation or they take on a country elsewhere, it's important to get an understanding of what the pasture growth curve looks for that environment and matching their system. Ensuring that we've got adequate female replacement numbers always coming through, so we would certainly recommend retaining 90% or more of heifers, and let fertility, obviously the bull in inverted commas, be the first selection tool. So any selection pressure we place on heifers pre-breeding is only going to reduce our fertility potential, and the outcome of the heifer's fertility is going to have a far bigger economic impact than their genetic selection. So I think it's important to leave genetic selection to the bull team and understand that our management and our selection of the heifers is what drives our fertility outcome. So we can buy genetics in the bull, but we cannot buy fertility in the bull. Ensuring replacement heifers reach critical mating weights as a minimum. Understanding your mature cow weight's probably the trick here, but the recommendation at present is 60 to 65% of that mature cow weight. But having an understanding of what that weight is important, and certainly if you don't have an appreciation for that, then getting a bit of an idea from your bull breeder, if you've been purchasing genetics there for a long time, is one way to start. But developing and following a heifer growth curve is important, because it just lets us know how we're tracking, and in a tough year you might be below that growth curve aim, but at least we have an idea of where we're trying to get to, and we can budget on what we might need to instigate to get there. Body condition targets. So spring calvers, the recommendation is a body condition score of 2.5 out of 5 at the time of calving, as where with autumn calvers it's probably a score better, so 3.5 out of 5 at calving. Now this little table on the right here, I'll just get my pointer again. Across the top here we've got body condition score at calving. So these are the light cows, 1.5 to 2 out of 5 score, medium 2.5 to 3, and then heavy 3.5 to 4. And on this side, we've got the feed availability, so high feed and low feed. Now, I just want to look at these two columns in particular. So this is the days to return to cycling, which is the same as the postpartum interval. So how many days after calving until this animal will come into calving? What we can see is that if we've got a light cow, so 1.5 to 2 score body condition, and we've got that animal on low feed, that postpartum interval is going to be very close to 65 days. And if that's a first calver, a heifer getting ready for a second joining, that's going to be even longer than that. But if we happen to identify that our cows are light coming into calving, and we allocate them high feed post calving, then we can pull that back down to 49 days. Similarly, if we have a look up this other end, we've got the heavy cows at 3.5 to 4 score. We've got the high feed option. We can see that they're going to be about 31 day postpartum interval. Now, if they happen to go onto a low feed line, we can see that the cost is only about 7 days. So what I want to point out here is that there's a significantly bigger difference between providing nutrition post-calving to light cows than there is to heavy cows. So we know that the body condition that we've got on these cows is going to leave us in good stead for calving. And similarly down this end, if we've got cows that are light, we know that by providing high feed, we're going to get back to that 50 days, which is very workable. So I think that's a good little example of why this is important. As far as the postpartum interval, we would recommend a minimum of 40 days until Q-mate insertion in mature cows for breeding programs, and this means 50 days to AI or to the time of heat in a recip program. First calvers will typically need an additional 10 days and probably a half score of body condition as a target. And we need to make sure that we provide adequate feed. Now, that's a bit of a throwaway term, but what I think is important is ensuring that we provide the better feed to first calvers and mature cows. They really need to be pushed along. They're in a period of their life where they're trying to grow themselves as well as trying to resume cycling. So we need to provide the highest quality nutrition at that time of year to our first calvers. Bulls. So we spoke a little bit about removing sub or infertile bulls with existing issues. So the important thing here is to source our introductions from reputable studs and inquire as to the disease protocols on farm. And then with the bulls that we've already got, completing an annual veterinary bull breeding soundness examination is critical. This has two outcomes. I think we often gloss over the real value of bull testing, but obviously the primary outcome is to remove infertile bulls, but more potentially, just as importantly, is that we identify and create the opportunity to manage the high risk bulls. So what I mean by that is that when we examine bulls, it's like any group of athletes. We're going to identify animals that have got niggling issues or minor issues. And then we're going to identify animals that have got big issues. And the big issues are the infertile guys, but the minor issues we can manage. So what we're going to do there is, based on whatever those issues are, we can reduce their mating potential. We can ensure that they're multi-side joined only with a high fertility bull, and we can observe them closer. So that's a really important point. Minimising the negative effects that develop during the joining period. We all know that bulls have got a very real ability to injure themselves, and a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that once I test the bull, that bull is fine. What a bull test suggests to us is that at this point in time, that bull is fertile, but anything could happen, from an injury to an infection. It doesn't take much for that bull to develop an issue. So keeping an eye on our bull team during joining is really important. Observing working bulls, it's important to know that a lot of the action happens between dusk and dawn. So, you know, the 11, 12 o'clock bull check is probably a little too casual and not going to pick up the issue. So we really need to be getting out there at a time when the bulls are doing their work, so that we can be close to the action. Educating staff on how to observe bulls at work is really important, and I think that's why bull testing with a serviceability test is a really good step to starting this, because we can explain to clients and to their staff what it is they're looking for. Multi-side joining, I cannot see a good reason in commercial herds to do anything but multi-side joining. We as managers, we don't want to be the reason that we've limited the ability of a fertile bull to find a fertile cow. So that's an important link. If single sire mobs are being used, it's really important that we rotate these single sires. We don't want a bull that's either gone under the radar and been missed the testing, or whether he's developed an issue that we haven't picked up. We don't want that bull to be able to have a negative influence on the result. And the final comment on bulls is, I think it's important to mix age groups and high-risk bulls. So we do not want to rely on inexperienced bulls. By mixing these inexperienced bulls with experienced bulls, and similarly, if we've got sub-fertile bulls, by mixing them with really high fertility bulls, then we reduce the risk of these bulls letting us down. So the diseases, it's ultimately a whole nother talk, but just to touch off on it, we've got vibriosis. This can be really quite effectively prevented through an annual pre-joining vaccination of the bull team. Generally, vaccination of females is not required unless we're trying to work our way out of a confirmed infection. But as a prevention strategy, it's the bull team only. It's really important here to avoid any sharing of bulls. So that's the most common point of introduction is intentional or unintentional sharing of bulls. Pestivirus, the most important thing with pestivirus is to simply understand the herd's immunity status. So based on that, there's a number of options for prevention, but if you can understand your herd status and then develop and maintain a prevention program, then that's the best way to manage it. There's obviously vaccine options and biosecurity options, but you've got to understand where your herd's at to start with. Lepto, we would recommend an annual 7-in-1 vaccination program for benefits for animal and human health. So that one's pretty easy. And then we've got penile injuries and infections in bulls. This is a really common issue in virgin bulls, and I think what's important, I've got a picture on the side here, which is a pretty typical preputial tear in a virgin bull. Excuse me. What's important with these is that they are treatable, and the more prompt the veterinary attention is, the better the prognosis. So a lot of people think that once these penile injuries are sustained, that they're untreatable, and a lot of them go longer than they should. But if we can get access to these, then we can typically improve the situation. But what's even more important than that is preventing them, and understanding that virgin bulls that are inexperienced are unexposed to environmental pathogens in the new female herd. And that's not saying that herds have a infection. There's a general population of pathogens in any group of animals, and the issue with new bulls is that they are coming from one group into a new group and they're naive or they're unexposed to that new group of bugs. So managing the introduction, exposing bulls to a small number of cull females at a time when they have a low workload expectation is a really important way of giving them some natural immunity before they go out at time. And the other part to this is working them with experienced bulls so that they ultimately don't work in the way a new bull works. So if there's a mature bull in there, that bull is going to slow down the work rate of the young bull, ultimately because he's more dominant. But once that mature bull has served a female, he will move away and the young bull will get his opportunity. So the final point here is that I just want to reiterate that short calving periods don't require short joining periods. So making use of age pregnancy diagnosis and ensuring that we collect and record the data when we do is really important. And from the results of that joining, we can select for a profitable calving. So just got a little example here. This is a natural joining starting at day 0. We've got pregnancy rate up the y-axis, and we can see that these heifers are joined for 3 cycles. So that's a pretty standard joining for a 9-week joining for heifers. Now, if we intend to turn over 25% of our cow herd, we're going to need to keep 60% of the heifers. So if we select and join the 60% of heifers that we think are the most valuable, this is going to require a 90% pregnancy rate to get enough to get that 25% turnover. So if we join for 60 days, this is an average calving date of day 23. Alternatively, we're suggesting that we join 90% of heifers. And if we join 90%, we're only going to require 62% pregnant, which is a 30-day joining period or an average calving date of day 14. And the difference between these two lines, so this I'll grab my little pointer again. This line out here is a 60-day joining to get 90% of those heifers pregnant because we only kept 60% of them. This line here is the 60% preg rate because we joined 90% of them. So the difference in here is $45 per calf out of those heifers because we retain 90% of them. Now, our recommendation is that you don't have to run the risk of having that 30-day joining, because if you join them for the 3 cycles and we go in and we scan the pregnancies, which needs to be done ultimately within 100 days of the bulls going in, so we need to be at least 30 days after the removal of bulls, but we want to be within 100 days of the bull introduction. So that's the time frame. We can identify the pregnancies in the 1st cycle, in the 2nd cycle, the 3rd cycle. We can retain however many are needed for adequate numbers, and then the surplus can be sold as PTIC or sold into the feeder stream. There's a couple of sale options there, but understanding that if we select out 60%, we have to join them for 60 days. That's costing us about $45 per calf relative to just joining the lot. So in summary, I'd like everybody to just take away that fertility is about targeting average calving dates, not pregnancy rates, and that this is certainly achieved through management. So we are in control of our fertility outcome, which is the spread of calves. Profitability is driven by when cows are pregnant, not if they are. Beef fertility starts with heifer management. So if you took nothing away from this except for retaining 90% plus, then and letting fertility or the bull be the first selection tool, then I think you'll be a more profitable system. Aim for short calving periods, knowing that doesn't necessarily require short joining periods. We have tools to make that link. And identify and mitigate common risks in high performance herds. Thank you. Hopefully we still have a few people that kept their warm seat and we've got a few questions.
Thanks very much, Shane. That's an excellent presentation, and it's certainly, I believe, redefines the way that we look at fertility. Sometimes we think it's quite a simple thing, but when you actually drill down into it like you have, you realise there's many aspects to it. So thank you. We do have a couple of questions from the crew. The first is, a question saying around the cow to bull ratio after AI. So is the 30-to-1 cow to bull ratio after AI based on the total number of cows being joined or the number of cows still cycling after AI?
That's a really good question. The answer is it's the number of animals joined in the beginning. So if you AI 100 heifers, then they need 3 to 4 bulls put in with them for the cycle after. And the justification of that is that the animals are going to come in over ultimately a 3 to 5 day window. So if we AI the 100 animals and 50 to 60% of them go pregnant, there is obviously only 40 to 50% that are going to cycle, but those animals are going to come in over a 3 to 5 day window. So if we do the maths on that, we can see that. Let me work this one out. So if we just look at 30, if we look at 30 for one bull, so if half of them are pregnant, we've got 15 animals, there's going to be 3 animals per day cycling. So that is a workload on the bull. If we compare that to a bull that we put out with 60 females that are naturally mated, of those 60 females, not everyone is going to be cycling on the day the bulls go in. So let's assume that 2/3 of them are cycling. That's 40 animals. They're going to cycle on a 21-day estrus cycle. That means 2 animals per day, as where we're talking on a 1-to-30 ratio with a 50% preg rate, 3 animals per day. So we can see that 1 bull per 30 animals after a breeding program is a higher work rate than 1 bull per 60 females in a natural mate. I hope I've explained that.
Shane, no, that's excellent. The next question that we have, you just mentioned with respect to mix of, that you've got high risk bulls and managing those bulls, and you obviously want to put a proportion of quite good bulls in there, and you then can obviously put risky bulls in as well in a multi-side joining. Do you have a magic proportion of risky bulls that you would be happy to put into a joining group?
It's an interesting question. It sort of depends on why we're calling them a risk, and by that I mean what we've identified as their subfertility issue. We know that a really high fertility bull that stays fertile through the joining period is capable of covering 100 females in a normal joining period, and so we're reasonably comfortable to pair up a high fertility bull and a high risk bull or a subfertile bull, knowing that if that second bull were to break down because of his issue that we've identified, the other bull is likely to cover the majority of his workload. And so I suppose that's a roundabout way of suggesting that for every subfertile bull, I would want a high fertile bull. We haven't looked at quantifying it that way because I think it's important to know what the issues are. But we need, for every subfertile bull, you need to be working on having, I think, at least one high fertility bull in the group. Yeah.
Awesome. We've got heaps of questions coming in now. The next one is vaccinating bulls for pestivirus enough, or do we need to vaccinate the heifers as well?
The important thing with pestivirus, and it makes a whole topic of its own. The important thing with pestivirus is understanding the immunity status of the herd, and in a herd that is naive, you would manage it differently to a herd where it is endemic. And by endemic, I mean has the infection at large. What we're worried about with pestivirus is the infection of an animal whilst it is either joining or pregnant. And so vaccination of the bull is of significantly lower value than vaccination of the female. But I can't stress enough how it's important to understand the immune status of those heifers before we join them. Now, if vaccination is the protocol, then I would absolutely be vaccinating the heifers. By vaccinating a bull in a group of heifers that are not vaccinated and they come in contact with pestivirus, the vaccination of the bull will be of zero value in protecting that group. So there's 2 answers. One is important to have a understanding of the herd immunity status. But if you're going to go with vaccine, then vaccinating the heifers is far more important than vaccinating the bull.
Wonderful. 3 more questions. How important is libido testing and as well as semen testing?
So libido testing, I suppose, if I had them in person, I'd just quantify whether they're talking about genuine libido or service capacity testing or just serviceability testing. What we do with bull testing, and what we recommend producers do with bull testing, is a physical examination of their reproductive equipment, let's say, structural assessment, a vaccination for Vibrio, and then a serviceability test. And by serviceability test, we want to observe that bull has the equipment he needs and is able to use it to serve a female. Libido testing itself, as in timing a bull over a fixed period of time and measuring how many serves that bull achieves, is a beneficial tool, but it's out of favour due to the cost of collecting that information when we are generally multi-sire joining these bulls anyway. And semen testing is also an important way of assessing a bull's fertility. But if we look at the data and the breakdown on why bulls are failing, 90% of the reasons that bulls fail joinings are related to the ability for that bull to seek and serve females. So I would see serviceability testing as a far more important component of assessing a bull's fertility than semen. But semen is an option, and if we're going to test that bull as thoroughly as we can, then it's on the list. But if we had to pick between the two, serviceability testing would certainly be our trump.
Excellent. The next one is, do you have a preference for multi-bull joining versus rotating single bulls?
We would be an advocate for multi-side joining all the time. There's a few counter arguments. I mean, single side joining with rotation is commonly used and can be run really well. In effect, the reason multi-side joining is better is it takes a lot of pressure off the manager. And what that means is that if there's a bull out there where we haven't identified a subfertility issue, or a sub or infertility issue develops during the joining, then he is going to be covered effectively on a daily basis by his fertile bull team mates. If we go a single sire rotation, there is the opportunity for there to be a joining failure for that cycle until we rotate the bulls. So there's some interesting figures you can do to compare putting an infertile bull out to work and using that in single sire without rotation, single sire with rotation, and multi-sire joining. And I can tell you that you're likely to achieve 20 to 25% better pregnancy rate with multi-sire joining than you are single sire and rotation. So that would form the basis of us being a bigger advocate of multi-sire joining.
Wonderful. And the very last question I have here is, are these guidelines / figures the same for Bos Indicus and Bos Taurus cattle? And just a nice comment to say thank you and a very informative session.
Thank you for the thank you. I would suggest that these figures are for Bos Taurus cattle in Southern Australian beef systems, unfortunately. So possibly room for another sort of set of guidelines to be provided, but they're for southern beef systems.
Sure. I mean, I would imagine that, you know, potentially the same concepts apply, but maybe the window might be just a little bit wider. Maybe would be my suggestion, but yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you. There was just another question asking whether the availability of this presentation after the fact. If you'll just note, we have taken a recording of this whole webinar. So if there's any aspect of this that you would like to revisit and seek clarification, we will be posting it up on our Repro 360 website. The link is down there below. But if you go under there, under the resources, the webinar section, we post all of our webinars that we do. So at any point in time, you can go back through. Equally, we welcome you guys to get in touch. and that way, yeah, we can help you out if you've got any further questions on the topic. Okay, thank you. I will shut the webinar down now. It's been an absolute pleasure, Shane, and I'm sure many people have got a lot out of this this evening.
Thanks for everyone's attendance. Good night.
Good night.